November 14th, 1965. Deep in the Vietnamese jungle, the silence seemed heavier than the heat. A young American soldier gripped his rifle tightly as he surveyed the dense vegetation around him. Moisture dripped down his face, a mingling of sweat and dirt. Ahead of him lay only trees, shadows, and an unseen enemy. The war he had imagined, with clear front lines and defined battles, simply did not exist there. In that place, danger could arise from any direction, at any second. And at that moment, thousands of kilometers away, military strategists in Hanoi and Moscow believed they had reached a simple conclusion. The United States was about to face a war they didn't know how to fight. For months, reports from the jungle reinforced this idea. American forces were entering completely unknown territory. The jungle was dense, the paths invisible, and the enemy seemed to vanish into thin air after each attack. For the Soviet strategists analyzing the conflict, Vietnam represented something very specific. It wasn't just a local war. It was a test, a strategic experiment to gauge how far American power could truly go. Many believed they knew the answer. They observed the political behavior of the United States, an open society divided by debates and public opinion, and concluded that this type of country could not withstand a long war in hostile territory. For them, the logic was clear. The longer the war lasted, the weaker the American will to continue fighting would become. This conviction did not arise from nothing. There were historical precedents that seemed to confirm this view. Just a few years earlier, France had tried to control the same territory and failed dramatically. A modern army, equipped with Western technology, had been defeated by forces that knew the jungle like no other. For many Soviet analysts, the lesson seemed obvious. The Vietnamese jungle was not just a battlefield, it was a weapon, an environment that slowly swallowed any foreign force that tried to dominate it. And in the first months of the American military presence, everything seemed to be heading exactly in that direction. Patrols would disappear into the vegetation for days without encountering the enemy. Bases were attacked in the early morning by combatants who emerged from the shadows and vanished before any organized response could occur. Soldiers reported hearing footsteps in the jungle without ever seeing who was moving. In some cases, simple traps made of wood and bamboo caused more casualties than direct confrontations. To those observing from afar, it seemed as if a superpower was fighting against something invisible. But there was a detail that many analysts completely ignored. While the war seemed stagnant inside the jungle, something different was happening outside. In American command centers, officers were analyzing every report, every mistake, and every ambush with obsessive attention. The war wasn't just being fought, it was being studied, dissected, and transformed into data. Each patrol that returned from the jungle brought new information. Each failure generated new questions, and little by little, a pattern began to emerge. Soldiers arriving in Vietnam during that period often described the feeling of fighting a phantom enemy. But for some commanders, this perception revealed something even more important. If the enemy could disappear into the jungle, then perhaps the problem wasn't just the jungle. Perhaps the problem was the way the war was being waged. This question began to circulate among American military strategists. What if the war didn't need to be fought in the traditional way? Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, reports continued to arrive at Soviet offices in Moscow. The initial numbers seemed to confirm expectations. The war was becoming long, complicated, and unpredictable. Exactly the kind of conflict that could wear down a foreign power. Many analysts believed they were witnessing the beginning of an inevitable process. For them, history seemed to be repeating an old pattern. Great empires entering distant territories and slowly being consumed by wars they could not control. But history rarely follows the script that strategists imagine. And in Vietnam, there was a variable that few were taking into account. The United States wasn't just fighting that war. They were learning from it. And when an industrial, technological, and military power learns quickly in the midst of conflict, the rules of war can change suddenly. At that point in history, almost no one realized that something was beginning to change. To many observers, Vietnam still seemed like just another difficult war in hostile territory. But in the military bases, planning centers, and factories on the other side of the Pacific, silent decisions were being made, decisions that would completely change the way that war would be fought. And when that change finally became visible on the battlefield, many of the strategists who believed they understood Vietnam would realize something disturbing. Perhaps they weren't just facing American soldiers in the jungle. Perhaps they were facing an entire system capable of reinventing itself while the war was still raging. In the first months of the war, many American soldiers arrived in Vietnam with a strange sense of historical déjà vu. Many had fathers or uncles who had fought in World War II or in Korea. They grew up hearing stories of battles with defined fronts, tanks advancing across open fields, and planes crisscrossing the sky in large formations. But in Vietnam, nothing seemed to follow that pattern. There were no clear lines. There were no devastated cities marking the advance of an army. There was only jungle, small villages, and an enemy that seemed to know every inch of that territory. For many young soldiers, the daily routine felt more like a test of endurance than a traditional war. Imagine walking for hours in sweltering heat, with heavy equipment on your back, not knowing if your next step would land on solid ground or a trap hidden beneath dry leaves. Some veterans would later recall that on certain days, the most terrifying sound wasn't gunfire, but the complete silence of the jungle. When the birds stopped singing, many knew something was wrong. The Vietnamese fighters understood this psychological effect perfectly. They knew they didn't need to win large battles to make an impact. A quick attack, disappearing into the vegetation and leaving behind any doubt, was enough. This strategy created a kind of constant pressure that few Western soldiers had experienced before. In some cases, an American unit could spend days patrolling without seeing the enemy, only to face a sudden ambush that lasted only a few minutes and then ended as quickly as it had begun. For Soviet analysts observing the war from a distance, this type of situation seemed to confirm an old theory. They believed that American power depended on direct confrontations, on large battles where technology and industrial superiority could make a difference. In Vietnam, this advantage seemed to disappear within the jungle, and the more reports arrived describing ambushes, traps, and night attacks, the more confidence grew among those who believed that the United States was entering a conflict impossible to win. But the reality within the American units began to tell a slightly different story. As the months passed, the soldiers began to better understand the environment in which they were fighting. Experience on the ground began to replace the military theory that had been taught at training bases in the United States. Small details began to make a difference. A strange movement in the trees, a seemingly little-used dirt path, a village too quiet for that time of day. Gradually, what seemed like an impenetrable jungle began to reveal signs that only constant practice could teach them to interpret. This learning process happened silently, almost invisible to those observing the war from afar. But for the soldiers in the field, each patrol became a kind of practical survival lesson. Many veterans would later remember that Vietnam taught quickly. Those who didn't learn fast enough simply didn't return home. Meanwhile, another transformation was taking place far from the front lines. American officers began to realize that this war demanded a completely different form of mobility. Moving slowly through the jungle put soldiers at a constant disadvantage. The enemy could choose when to attack and when to disappear. It was like trying to chase shadows. And it was at this moment that an idea began to gain traction among military planners. If the terrain made movement difficult on the ground, perhaps the solution lay in the sky. The massive introduction of helicopters began to slowly change the dynamics of the conflict. Suddenly, entire units could be rapidly transported to areas that previously took days to reach. Imagine a group of Vietnamese soldiers believing they had hours or even days to move through the jungle, only to suddenly hear the distant sound of approaching rotors. Within minutes, American troops could land exactly where no one expected. This type of mobility began to create a new kind of uncertainty for the enemy. The jungle still offered protection, but it no longer guaranteed the same control of the terrain. Helicopters not only transported soldiers, but also evacuated the wounded, brought supplies, and allowed for much faster coordination between units scattered throughout the region. Gradually, the war began to transform into something that neither side had fully anticipated at the start. For many American soldiers, that sound of propellers became a powerful symbol. The Huey wasn't just a helicopter, it was the promise that no one was fighting alone in that jungle. It was the guarantee that, if something went wrong, there was a chance of getting out of there alive. That kind of seemingly simple confidence had a huge effect on troop morale. And it was precisely at this point that some more attentive observers began to notice something important. The war, which many believed to be merely a repetition of what had happened with the French, was beginning to follow a different path. Not because the jungle had changed, but because the Americans were beginning to change the way they were approaching that war. Even so, most strategists analyzing the conflict still believed that time was on North Vietnam's side. For them, each additional month of war meant more political pressure within the United States, more attrition, more doubt. What few imagined was that, while this war of attrition seemed to be progressing slowly, a new type of military power was being built on the battlefield. And when that power finally began to emerge clearly, many who observed the conflict would perceive something unsettling. Perhaps that war wasn't just testing American resilience, perhaps it was revealing just how far the United States was capable of adapting when faced with a challenge that no one had fully anticipated. Sometime later, something began to change in how American soldiers perceived the war. In the first few months, the dominant feeling was one of disorientation. The jungle seemed like an endless labyrinth, and the enemy seemed to appear out of nowhere. But gradually, what had previously seemed like chaos began to reveal patterns. Narrow trails hidden among the trees were not just random paths. Often they were carefully maintained logistical routes. Small, silent villages were not just isolated settlements. Some functioned as observation or support points. Every detail began to be analyzed with increasing attention. The war, which at first seemed invisible, began to show its structure. Within American bases, officers began gathering information from patrols, aerial photographs, and field reports. The goal was simple yet ambitious: to understand how the enemy truly moved, not just where they attacked, but how they thought. Military intelligence began connecting clues that, in isolation, seemed insignificant. A group seen crossing a river at a certain point, a shipment of supplies observed weeks earlier on a distant trail. Small observations began to form an invisible map of the war. This analysis process led to an unexpected conclusion. The enemy seemed unpredictable on the battlefield, but its logistics needed to follow specific routes, and these routes, even hidden by the jungle, did exist. This led American strategists to a question that would change many military decisions in the following years. If it was possible to identify these routes, would it be possible to disrupt the entire system that sustained the war? While this question circulated among commanders, another transformation was taking place in the combat units. Soldiers who had arrived without combat experience began to become jungle veterans. They learned to recognize specific sounds of the vegetation, to perceive subtle changes in the environment, and to react more quickly to unexpected situations. In many cases, this learning came from difficult experiences, but it generated real adaptation on the battlefield. But something even more important was happening. The American army wasn't just accumulating individual experience, it was transforming that experience into doctrine. Detailed reports were sent back to training centers. Tactics were revised, equipment was modified. What one soldier learned on patrol could influence the training of hundreds of other soldiers weeks later. This ability to transform experience into collective learning began to slowly alter the balance of warfare. And here, an interesting question arises. How many conflicts in history have shown an army adapting its own tactics while the war was still ongoing? Meanwhile, on the international stage, observers continued trying to interpret what was happening. Many Soviet analysts still believed that the decisive factor would be time. For them, the war would not be won in specific battles, but in the ability to resist for more years than the adversary. This logic seemed sound. History was full of examples of wars where the more persistent side ended up winning. However, there was one factor that began to challenge this prediction. The industrial and technological presence of the United States in the conflict was enormous. Ships crossed the Pacific, carrying equipment on an impressive scale. Air bases were being expanded at an accelerated pace. Helicopters, vehicles, and communication systems continued to arrive in the theater of operations. Even when units suffered losses, new troops and new resources quickly appeared. For many soldiers in the field, this logistics became something almost invisible, yet extremely present. When a helicopter evacuated a wounded soldier in minutes, when ammunition arrived at an isolated base, or when reinforcements appeared in a remote area of the jungle, that gigantic support network became evident. The war wasn't just what happened between trees and rivers. It was sustained by a global system of transportation, industry, and planning. But did the strategists observing the conflict truly grasp the scale of this system? Another element began to alter the perception of war: air mobility. Helicopters didn't just transport soldiers, they allowed something few armies had exploited on a large scale before. The ability to move units quickly to any point in the jungle completely transformed the pace of operations. Instead of long, predictable marches, American forces could suddenly appear in unexpected areas. For the Vietnamese fighters, this created a new variable in the conflict. The jungle still offered protection and concealment, but it no longer guaranteed absolute control of the terrain. In some cases, units that believed they were safe in isolated areas found American forces rapidly appearing via airborne landings. This gradual change began to produce psychological effects. The war, which had previously seemed to favor local knowledge of the terrain, was becoming more dynamic. The ability to move quickly altered tactical decisions on both sides. The battlefield was expanding vertically, not just horizontally. And here arises another question that few asked at the time. What if the real American advantage in that war lay not only in weapons or technology, but in the ability to reorganize the entire way of fighting? As the months progressed, the conflict began to reveal an increasingly stark contrast. On one side, forces that relied heavily on familiarity with the terrain and strategic patience. On the other, a power that was gradually redesigning its own tactics to confront an environment that initially seemed impossible. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was built patrol after patrol, report after report, decision after decision. And perhaps that's exactly what makes this period of the war so interesting for those who analyze history today. What initially seemed like an unfavorable scenario slowly began to transform into a laboratory for military adaptation. But this transformation was still far from reaching its peak, and as the next chapters of this war began to unfold, something unexpected would become clear to observers around the world. Vietnam was not just testing the resilience of the United States, it was testing how far a modern power could reinvent its own way of fighting in the midst of conflict. In the late 1960s, something began to happen in the skies over Vietnam that few strategists had predicted when the war began. For those on the ground, it often started with a distant sound, a deep rumble that first appeared as an echo on the horizon and then grew to dominate the air. For American soldiers isolated on patrols or in forward operating bases, that sound had a clear meaning. Help was coming. But for many North Vietnamese fighters, the same sound represented something different: the constant presence of a military machine capable of completely transforming the battlefield. American air power began to play an increasingly decisive role. B-52 strategic bombers, originally designed for potential nuclear confrontations during the Cold War, began to be used in conventional missions over dense jungle regions. Each aircraft could carry tens of tons of bombs. When entire formations of these aircraft operated together, the impact was impressive. In some attacks, entire areas of the jungle were hit in a matter of minutes. For many soldiers on the ground, the effect was difficult to describe. Some reported that the ground seemed to shake as if it were an earthquake. But air power wasn't just a show of force. It was also part of a much larger strategy. For years, the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail functioned as a vital supply network connecting North Vietnam to forces operating in the south. This network wasn't just a road. It was a complex system of trails, hideouts, depots, and alternate routes that traversed forests and mountains. Trucks, reinforced bicycles, and even human porters transported ammunition, food, and equipment along these routes. For many military strategists, disrupting this supply flow became a paramount priority. The United States began employing a combination of aerial reconnaissance, electronic sensors, and coordinated attacks to try to detect and target these logistical routes. In some sections, sensors were launched from aircraft to detect vibrations caused by ground movements. In others, surveillance aircraft flew for long hours, trying to identify even the slightest signs of activity. It was an attempt to transform the jungle, which previously seemed to hide everything, into a more observable environment. This type of operation revealed something surprising about modern warfare. Even in an extremely difficult environment, the combination of technology, logistics, and persistence could alter the dynamics of the conflict. At certain times, thousands of air missions were carried out in just a few months. American pilots flew daily in dangerous conditions, facing anti-aircraft defenses, unstable weather, and complex terrain. Many of these pilots were young men who, just a few years earlier, had been in universities or small American towns. Now they were flying missions over one of the most challenging regions on the planet. There are accounts of pilots who, after completing an intense mission, would return to base and still find time to write letters home or talk with comrades about the next day. This routine reflected something deeply connected to American culture at the time. Many of those men believed they were participating in a greater effort, a mission that involved not only military strategy but also national values. For them, each mission was more than an operational task. It was part of a commitment to the country and to their comrades on the ground. The numbers from this effort are still impressive today. Throughout the war, millions of tons of bombs were dropped in various air operations. In some years, the intensity of air operations in Vietnam surpassed that of many periods of World War II. This level of activity demanded a gigantic logistical effort. Aircraft needed to be maintained, fuel needed to be transported, and spare parts needed to reach the bases quickly. All of this depended on a support chain that spanned the Pacific and connected American factories directly to the battlefield. This logistical system reflected a historical aspect of American capability that had already been demonstrated in previous conflicts. During World War II, the United States had mobilized an entire industry to sustain operations in two oceans simultaneously. Now, decades later, that capability remained. Cargo ships crossed the ocean, carrying equipment, vehicles, and supplies that kept operations running daily. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of this system was how it sustained troop morale. For a soldier at a remote base, knowing that an entire network was working to support him made a real difference. Helicopters bringing supplies, aircraft providing air cover, and medical units ready to evacuate the wounded created an environment where soldiers knew they were not alone. This kind of constant support gradually began to alter the perception of the war among many combatants. What at first seemed like a battle against an impossible environment began to show signs of equilibrium. Technology, logistics, and adaptation were slowly redefining what was possible in that conflict. Even so, for many international observers, the war still seemed an enigma. Some analysts continued to believe that no level of military power could fully compensate for the challenges of irregular warfare on foreign soil. Others were beginning to realize that the conflict was revealing something deeper about how the United States conducted its military operations. Perhaps the most important element was not just the power of the weapons or the number of aircraft in the sky. Perhaps it was the combination of innovation, organization, and human determination that allowed an entire country to sustain such a complex military effort for so long. And as the war progressed, a question began to arise more frequently among strategists around the world. If the United States was capable of mobilizing this level of technology, industry, and adaptation in an environment as harsh as the Vietnamese jungle, how far could this capability extend in other Cold War scenarios? The answer to that question was not yet clear at that time, but the events that would unfold in the following years would begin to show that the Vietnam War was not merely a regional conflict. In many respects, it was revealing to the entire world how American military power was capable of transforming itself when faced with unexpected challenges. As the years passed, the Vietnam War began to reveal a dimension that few had foreseen at the beginning of the conflict. It was not just a battle fought in the jungle. It was also a dispute between two completely different systems of sustaining war. For those on the battlefield, this often became evident in simple moments. A helicopter arriving with drinking water after days of patrolling, a medical evacuation happening in minutes, or an advanced base that, even isolated, received ammunition, fuel, and food constantly. For many American soldiers, these details were concrete proof that a gigantic structure was operating behind every operation. The war didn't depend solely on the courage of those on the ground. It was sustained by a network that began in factories, ports, and logistics centers thousands of kilometers away. Trucks were loaded at bases in the Pacific, planes crossed oceans transporting equipment, and ships unloaded tons of supplies daily. Every piece of equipment that arrived in Vietnam was part of a much larger system. This type of organization reflected something deeply connected to American history. Since World War II, the United States had demonstrated a unique ability to transform its economy into a military support machine. During that earlier conflict, factories that previously produced cars and appliances began manufacturing airplanes, ships, and tanks on an impressive scale. Decades later, this experience still influenced how the country faced new military challenges. In Vietnam, this logistical capability meant that units in the field were rarely completely isolated for long. When a position needed reinforcements, helicopters could transport soldiers quickly. When wounded soldiers needed treatment, specialized medical teams were ready to act. This system made a significant difference in the combat experience. Many veterans would later recall that the feeling of constant support made all the difference in difficult moments. But this structure wasn't just a logistical advantage. It also had a significant psychological impact. For a soldier in the middle of the jungle, knowing that there was an entire chain of people working to ensure their safety and support created a profound sense of trust. Pilots, mechanics, radio operators, medics, and engineers were all part of a collective effort that kept operations running day after day. Meanwhile, international observers continued trying to understand what was really happening in that conflict. Some analysts believed that the war would be decided simply by time. Others began to realize that something different was happening. The American presence was not just military. It was technological, industrial, and organizational all at once. This created a type of power that was difficult to measure solely by the number of soldiers or weapons on the battlefield. In many American bases, the daily routine clearly demonstrated this difference. Even in isolated regions, soldiers had access to advanced communication equipment, air transport, and efficient medical support. These resources did not eliminate the risks of war, but they significantly altered how operations were conducted. Instead of relying solely on slow movements through the jungle, units could plan rapid and coordinated operations supported by different types of resources. This operational model began to attract the attention of strategists around the world. For the first time, a conflict was demonstrating how technology, logistics, and mobility could be integrated into a single operational system. Vietnam was becoming a real laboratory for new forms of modern warfare. Tactics were tested, evaluated, and modified in real time. For many American soldiers, however, this strategic dimension was rarely visible in their daily lives. What they experienced was the immediate reality of the next mission, the next patrol, or the next operation. Still, there were moments when the scale of that effort became evident. Sometimes it was enough to look up at the sky and see helicopters crossing the horizon, or hear the distant sound of aircraft operating above the jungle. These moments served as a reminder that the war involved far more than what could be seen from a single point on the ground. It was a conflict that mobilized the resources of an entire country. From factory workers to pilots flying over hostile regions, millions of people participated directly or indirectly in that effort. Over time, this mobilization began to reveal something important to military analysts. The United States possessed a strategic characteristic that was difficult to replicate: the ability to sustain complex operations for extended periods without completely disrupting the functioning of its economy and society. This balance between military power and economic structure was something few countries could achieve. This factor began to influence how many strategists interpreted the conflict. The Vietnam War was not merely a territorial or political dispute. It also showed how different national systems reacted when confronted with a prolonged challenge. On one side, there was a strategy based on resistance and local knowledge of the terrain. On the other, a system capable of mobilizing technology, industry, and logistics on an impressive scale. As the conflict progressed, a question began to arise more frequently in military circles around the world. If the United States was capable of maintaining this level of mobilization in an environment as harsh as the Vietnamese jungle, what did this mean for other potential conflicts during the Cold War? That question didn't have a simple answer at that time. But the events that would continue to unfold in the following years would begin to show that Vietnam was revealing something much bigger than just a regional war. It was showing how far an entire nation could go when it decided to mobilize its resources to face a complex challenge. And for many of the men who fought in that jungle, that story was far from over. At some point towards the end of the war, many of the men who spent years in Vietnam realized something curious. When they first arrived, the jungle seemed like a strange and hostile world, a place where every step was uncertain and every night seemed too long. But over time, that environment ceased to be just an unknown battlefield. It became a place where soldiers learned to trust each other, to react quickly, and to face situations that seemed impossible when it all began. Veterans would later recall that the true transformation didn't just happen in strategy or technology. It happened in the people. Young men who arrived as inexperienced recruits returned home as men who had faced one of the toughest environments in modern military history. Many of them carried with them for the rest of their lives the memories of comrades, missions, and split-second decisions that could define the fate of everyone around them. This human dimension of war is something that is often lost when we only look at maps, numbers, and statistics. It's easy to talk about tons of equipment, air operations, or military strategies. But at the end of each mission, there were real men making real decisions. There were pilots flying knowing they could face anti-aircraft fire at any moment. There were medics racing against time to save lives. There were soldiers walking through the jungle knowing that each patrol could be different from the last. At the same time, the Vietnam War also left a profound mark on how the world viewed American military power. For some observers, the conflict demonstrated the limits of military force in complex and irregular warfare. For others, it revealed something different: the impressive adaptability of a nation that, when faced with unexpected challenges, attempts to reinvent its own strategies. This duality is perhaps one of the reasons why Vietnam continues to be studied by historians, strategists, and veterans to this day. It wasn't just a conventional war. It was a moment when technology, culture, politics, and human experience intersected intensely. If there's one lesson many veterans highlight when looking back on that period, it's the importance of team spirit. In extreme situations, what truly kept the units functioning wasn't just the equipment or strategic plans. It was the trust between the men who were there together. Soldiers protected each other, pilots returned to rescue comrades, and medical teams risked everything to save lives. This sense of mutual commitment has become part of the collective memory of an entire generation. Even decades later, many of these men still meet at veterans' reunions, sharing stories and remembering those who did not return home. For them, Vietnam is not just a chapter in a history book. It is an experience that has permanently shaped their lives. At the same time, history also shows that every war brings difficult questions. Conflicts are not just about victory or defeat. They involve complex choices, political decisions, and consequences that extend for decades. In the case of Vietnam, these questions continue to be debated to this day by historians and experts in international relations. But regardless of political or strategic interpretations, one thing remains clear. Millions of American men and women served in that conflict with dedication and courage. Many of them left their families, their cities, and their lives to fulfill a mission they believed was important. This personal commitment is something that deserves to be remembered whenever we talk about that period. And perhaps that's precisely why stories like these continue to be told. Not just to analyze military strategies, but to remember the human experiences that are part of history. Each generation needs to look to the past to better understand the present and learn from the decisions that shape the world today. When we hear accounts from veterans or study episodes from that conflict, we are dealing with something much bigger than a simple historical record. We are looking at moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary situations. And these stories help remind us that history is not made only by leaders or governments. It is also built by individuals who, in critical moments, make difficult choices. If you've made it this far in this video, you're probably also interested in these stories that shape the modern world. And if this content has brought new reflections or sparked curiosity about this period of history, it's worth continuing to explore these themes. Therefore, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to the channel to follow new content like this. Like the video so that more people can discover these stories that are often forgotten. And if you have any questions, opinions, or even family experiences related to this period of history, leave a comment below. Many of the most interesting conversations arise precisely when people share different perspectives. History lives on whenever someone decides to listen to it, question it, and learn from it. And every comment, every discussion, and every new question helps keep these important memories alive. Thank you for watching this far.